Chapter 7: The Comparative Analysis, Scientific Gatekeeping versus Political Tyranny. The forensic comparison between scientific gatekeeping and political tyranny reveals that intellectual suppression inflicts civilizational damage of qualitatively different magnitude and duration than even the most devastating acts of political violence. This analysis is not rhetorical, but mathematical, where the temporal scope, geographical reach, and generational persistence of epistemic crime create compound civilizational costs that exceed those of any documented political atrocity in human history. Adolf Hitler's regime represents the paradigmatic example of political tyranny in its scope, systematic implementation, and documented consequences. The Nazi system, operating from 1933 to 1945, directly caused the deaths of approximately 17 million civilians through systematic murder, forced labor, and medical experimentation. The geographical scope extended across occupied Europe, affecting populations in dozens of countries. The economic destruction included the elimination of Jewish-owned businesses, the appropriation of cultural and scientific institutions, and the redirection of national resources toward military conquest and genocide. The temporal boundaries of Nazi destruction were absolute and clearly defined. Hitler's death on April 30, 1945, and the subsequent collapse of the Nazi state terminated the systematic implementation of genocidal policies. The reconstruction of European civilization could begin immediately, supported by international intervention, economic assistance, and institutional reform. War crimes tribunals established legal precedents for future prevention, educational programs ensured historical memory of the atrocities, and democratic institutions were rebuilt with explicit safeguards against authoritarian recurrence. The measurable consequences of Nazi tyranny, while catastrophic in scope, were ultimately finite and recoverable. European Jewish communities, though decimated, rebuilt cultural and religious institutions. Scientific and educational establishments, though severely damaged, resumed operation with international support. Democratic governance returned to occupied territories within years of liberation. The physical infrastructure destroyed by war was reconstructed within decades. Most significantly, the exposure of Nazi crimes created global awareness that enabled recognition and prevention of similar political atrocities in subsequent generations. The documentation of Nazi crimes through the Nuremberg trials, survivor testimony, and historical scholarship created permanent institutional memory that serves as protection against repetition. The legal frameworks established for prosecuting crimes against humanity provide ongoing mechanisms for addressing political tyranny. Educational curricula worldwide include mandatory instruction about the Holocaust and its prevention, ensuring that each new generation understands the warning signs and consequences of authoritarian rule. In contrast, the scientific gatekeeping system implemented by modern confidence con artists operates through mechanisms that are structurally immune to the temporal limitations, geographical boundaries, and corrective mechanisms that eventually terminated political tyranny. The institutional suppression of scientific innovation creates compound civilizational damage that expands across indefinite time horizons without natural termination points or self-correcting mechanisms. The temporal scope of scientific gatekeeping extends far beyond the biological limitations that constrain political tyranny. Where Hitler's influence died with his regime, the epistemic frameworks established by scientific gatekeepers become embedded in educational curricula, research methodologies, and institutional structures that persist across multiple generations. The false cosmological models promoted by Tyson, the failed theoretical frameworks endorsed by Cox, and the unfalsifiable speculations popularized by Kaku become part of the permanent scientific record, influencing research directions and resource allocation for decades after their originators have died. The geographical reach of modern scientific gatekeeping exceeds that of any historical political regime through global media distribution, international educational standards, and coordinated research funding. Where Nazi influence was limited to occupied territories, the authority wielded by contemporary scientific confidence artists extends across all continents simultaneously through television programming, internet content, and educational publishing. The epistemic conditioning effects reach populations that political tyranny could never access, creating global intellectual uniformity that surpasses the scope of any historical authoritarian system. The institutional perpetuation mechanisms of scientific gatekeeping are qualitatively different from those available to political tyranny. Nazi ideology required active enforcement through military occupation, police surveillance, and systematic violence that became unsustainable as resources were depleted and international opposition mounted. Scientific gatekeeping operates through voluntary submission to institutional authority that requires no external enforcement once the conditioning con is complete. Populations trained to defer to scientific expertise maintain their intellectual submission without coercion, passing these attitudes to subsequent generations through normal educational and cultural transmission. The opportunity costs created by scientific gatekeeping compound across time in ways that political tyranny cannot match. Nazi destruction, while devastating in immediate scope, created opportunities for reconstruction that often exceeded pre-war capabilities. Post-war Europe developed more advanced democratic institutions, more sophisticated international cooperation mechanisms, and more robust economic systems than had existed before the Nazi period. The shock of revealed atrocities generated social and political innovations that improved civilizational capacity for addressing future challenges. Scientific gatekeeping creates the opposite dynamic: systematic foreclosure of possibilities that can never be recovered. Each generation trained in false theoretical frameworks loses access to entire domains of potential discovery that become permanently inaccessible. The students who spend years mastering string theory or dark matter cosmology cannot recover that time to explore alternative approaches that might yield breakthrough technologies. The research funding directed toward failed paradigms cannot be redirected toward productive alternatives once the institutional momentum is established. The compound temporal effects become exponential rather than linear because each foreclosed discovery prevents not only immediate technological applications, but entire cascades of subsequent innovation that could have emerged from those discoveries. The suppression of alternative energy research, for example, prevents not only new energy technologies, but all the secondary innovations in materials science, manufacturing processes, and social organization that would have emerged from abundant clean energy. The civilizational trajectory becomes permanently deflected onto lower capability paths that preclude recovery to higher potential alternatives. The corrective mechanisms available for addressing political tyranny have no equivalents in the scientific gatekeeping system. War crimes tribunals cannot prosecute intellectual fraud, democratic elections cannot remove tenured professors, and international intervention cannot reform academic institutions that operate through voluntary intellectual submission rather than coercive force. The victims of scientific gatekeeping are the future generations denied access to suppressed discoveries, which cannot testify about their losses because they remain unaware of what was taken from them. The documentation challenges are correspondingly greater because scientific gatekeeping operates through omission rather than commission. Nazi crimes created extensive physical evidence, concentration camps, mass graves, documentary records that enabled forensic reconstruction and legal prosecution. Scientific gatekeeping creates no comparable evidence trail because its primary effect is to prevent things from happening rather than causing visible harm. The researchers who never pursue alternative theories, the technologies that never get developed, and the discoveries that never occur leave no documentary record of their absence. Most critically, the psychological conditioning effects of scientific gatekeeping create self-perpetuating cycles of intellectual submission that have no equivalent in political tyranny. Populations that experience political oppression maintain awareness of their condition and desire for liberation that eventually generates resistance movements and democratic restoration. Populations subjected to epistemic conditioning lose the cognitive capacity to recognize their intellectual imprisonment, believing instead that they are receiving education and enlightenment from benevolent authorities. This represents the ultimate distinction between political and epistemic crime. Political tyranny creates suffering that generates awareness and resistance, while epistemic tyranny creates ignorance that generates gratitude and voluntary submission. The victims of political oppression know they are oppressed and work toward liberation, whereas the victims of epistemic oppression believe they are educated and work to maintain their conditioning. The mathematical comparison is therefore unambiguous. While political tyranny inflicts greater immediate suffering on larger numbers of people, epistemic tyranny inflicts greater long-term damage on civilizational capacity across indefinite time horizons. The compound opportunity costs of foreclosed discovery, the geographical scope of global intellectual conditioning, and the temporal persistence of embedded false paradigms create civilizational damage that exceeds by orders of magnitude the recoverable losses inflicted by even the most devastating political regimes.